It's very easy to write a language. It's very easy to read a language. It's hellishly terrifying to actually speak and to know that what you're saying makes sense to the person who's listening, especially if that person is a native speaker. As they say in Spanish, la vergüenza, the shame of launching into a foreign language and speaking it and hopefully holding your own and making yourself understood by others, and especially by natives.
Okay, thank you, Ken, for joining again. And today we're going to discuss the King's Speech.
Yeah, the King's Speech. Obviously, it's based upon historical fact. It's there is, unlike a lot of other films we've talked about, this is all, or the base story is based upon historical fact. The fact that the Duke of York at that particular point had a speech impediment. He later became king. The title of the film, The King's Speech, is in relation to the speech he gives declaring war or talking to the British public and the Commonwealth as a whole, informing them that Britain and the Commonwealth are now at war with Germany, which is where the title comes from. The film itself backtracks quite a few years to give some historical context as to what the problem was and the fact that he had a speech impediment. And this speech impediment, it's inferred as a result of his childhood and the fact that, his parents and his siblings mocked him and created problems for him, which exacerbated the speech problem that he had. That's kind of the base. And the story as it unfolds is about the Duke of York and his speech therapist, or his search to cure himself, or to be cured of his speech impediment, or at least to overcome his speech impediment. So he goes through several, I'm going to call them quacks, speech therapists, who put things like marbles into his mouth and all that kind of stuff. But he eventually comes across, or is united with, a speech therapist from Australia who helps him to overcome, but manage his speech problem. So like I say, a lot of this is based upon historical fact. In terms of the detail, how much is 100% correct and how much has been made up by the filmmakers is conjecture, because obviously there probably aren't a lot of official papers floating around. So in a nutshell, that's the story. Obviously we have a situation where with the films that we're looking at, and we have been looking at, we're quite often looking at simple films which are quite easy to follow in terms of the plot line. And obviously our last film, Spanglish, was about somebody learning a new language. This one is about somebody overcoming a speech impediment. So not quite the same, but it's about dominating spoken speech in one form or another. So that's probably one of the reasons I chose this film, was it's the element of spoken language, be it English, French, German, Spanish, whatever. It's about dominating in public, which is an extremely, extremely difficult thing to do. I've worked with groups of people who have been taught how to speak in public, and incredibly difficult thing to do. And they go through weeks of training to teach them how to develop the skills of speaking in public. And obviously what we have here in terms of the King's Speech is about the royals, I'm going to call it the royals generally, or those people in power, having to develop skills and speaking in public. And in relation to this film, the kind of the relatively early stages of radio, or the wireless as it was called, and still is to some extent by people, and becoming, I suppose, more household figures as a result of having to speak, having to make speeches to the public. And obviously if you have a speech impediment, having to speak in public and being so high profile, members of the royalty and or kings or queens or prime ministers or presidents or whatever it might be, this need and this ability to be able to speak in public is a very important skill. So that's the basis of why I chose this film. and why I thought it would be useful for those who are learning English or who are learning a language, but in this case, English, partially because, like I say, the quality of the speech. It's RP, it's the Queen's English or the King's English. So it's a very clean and easy to understand English, which I think for a foreign audience or an audience of people who are learning English, I think is a great and a great film to watch because it is clear. There's very little music soundtrack. It's a slow film, which is probably is quite common of the films that I try and choose, films which are slow, which are easy to watch, which aren't fast-paced, where the dialogue is more important than the action, and where music soundtracks don't override the speech. I think there's maybe only one or two little pieces in the film where music is used, but it's still quite subtle. Obviously it's about the history of my country. So for you, as an American, how did you see the film? How did you see the content of the film, the plot of the film?
Yeah, so I watched this probably when it came out in 2010, I believe, and was very interested in it because it has Colin Firth, and I really loved him in Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Darcy. But in any case, I watched it, and I think not being from the UK, not being from Britain, I didn't even pick up on the fact that this was the father of the current Queen Elizabeth. Second time round, after watching The Crown and stuff, I'm like, oh, okay, I don't know how I didn't notice that. Yes, I think I agree with you that it's very clear. I think it starts out in 1925, and he is going to address this huge crowd at like an exposition, open of an exposition.
Yeah.
And you can just see the fear of when he has to speak in front of this huge microphone. You can just see everyone else just like he's trying to get the words out, but he can't.
The king
and his wife, who really, she really cared about him and wanted to help him, and she was there and felt really bad about how he was having to address these people, not just in all the people watching, but all the people listening on the radio, like you said. And then you have this conversation with him and his father after like the Christmas. The father would talk to the nation for every Christmas, apparently.
All to each. I wish a happy Christmas. God bless you.
He said to his son, like, this is necessary. Before you could just, look good and not fall off a horse and to be a king, but now you have to talk on the radio and you have to invade everyone's living rooms. And I think the father knew that most likely his son was, this younger son was going to end up being the king because the older son was having these kind of affairs with married women and such. So he kind of...
A dreadful American woman.
Right, that's right, 3-time divorced American woman. So he kind of knew that was going to be the case, and so King George, who's Bertie or King George in the film, he's afraid of he's afraid of actually being king. He doesn't want his older brother to kind of screw it up because he knows he has this speech impediment. He just he's afraid of that happening.
You're right in that. Just after that speech, it's implied that he will be the next king and he will have to make these speeches. He will have to invade people's living rooms and make these speeches. But you kind of see that he's put upon by his father. And later on in the film, it's alluded to that that's probably one of the reasons that he has the speech impediment, not only because his father, but the rest of the family, his siblings also do the same thing. The need for him to be able to speak in public, being one, just a member of the royal family, but also potentially the future king, is vital because he is the person holding not only Britain but the Commonwealth together. He's the voice piece. He's the voice piece of authority, I suppose. He's the head of the church. He is the person who, in times of crisis, rather like we had at the moment, or we have had during COVID, where Her Majesty made the speeches to kind of, the speech about COVID over Christmas, which is quite a common thing to do, the Christmas speech, but also during times of real crisis, the royal family, the king or the queen, will make these broadcasts to help reassure the British public and the Commonwealth as a whole, and probably to some extent those watching around the world, that there is a stability. Obviously, when we look at this period of time, things like the radio were incredibly new. And as you say, you know, his first speech in terms of being in public was in front of, I think it was some kind of exposition, but there were military there. And as you said, all he had to do was not fall off a horse and just make this very simple speech. And he absolutely dies in front of people. He cannot string these two words together. And that's a major kind of problem, and it's a problem he has to overcome. When he meets up with Lionel, who's a lot more, Lionel being the Australian speech therapist, okay, he's not technically a speech therapist because he has no formal qualifications. He's gained his experience through helping troops from World War I. He's a failed actor, Lionel, the speech therapist. He's a failed actor. He's a wannabe thespian, but he's not very good. But he's gained this experience through helping troops after World War I to regain their speech, to kind of recover their speech. He is introduced to the royal family, but he's only introduced to them as just average Joes. I mean, he doesn't quite understand who they are until a little further down the line, when he suddenly twigs that who he's dealing with are members of the royal family, the future king potentially of the Commonwealth. But his approach is that it's his house, it's his office, and his rules dictate. That's where these meetings will take place. That's where the speech therapy will take place. All the way through, it's a very casual relationship between the pair of them. It's a casual relationship between him and the royal family. He doesn't seem to be put upon by them. They're not overbearing in terms of that. Initially, there's a bit of that, but I think he puts his foot down very quickly and says, no, these are my rules. You will follow my rules. We are going to help you overcome this speech impediment so that you can speak in public. Lionel as a character he's a great little character. He doesn't overplay anything except for his ham acting. I mean, he's really nice the way he does it. I liked his subtle accent, because obviously, again, I think when you listen to recordings from many, many years ago, people's accents in those days were very, very different, incredibly different to what they are today. I mean, even listen to Americans. I mean, we reviewed the film A Matter of Life and Death, or Stairway to Heaven, and the leading lady was an American who had an incredibly British accent. But when you hear a lot of people from that period of time, their accents are incredibly clipped and clean. So Lionel, as the Australian, has a very soft accent. So for those listening who are not native English speakers, it's almost impossible to realize that it potentially is Australian. There was just a slight twang there.
I wouldn't have gotten it.
We wouldn't have got. Yeah, I just did, because it's ever so subtle.
Yeah, I wouldn't have caught it until he mentioned that he was an Australian, because it was very, very subtle, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, this story is about the pair of them. I mean, there are other people on the periphery who come in. It's about the pair of them and how they develop this friendship, and how this friendship and the skills that Lionel has help Bertie overcome, or at least deal with the speech impediment that he has.
Yeah, I mean, I deal with or manage. I would say, like, they were tools to manage it, because even the you said that the name of the movie is for this very, very important speech. There's a quote at the end where he says, "Oh, you missed the W in a couple of his words," and he says, I had to do that so people would know it was me."
You still stammered on the W.
I had to say in a few, so they knew it was me.
And that actually is like a real quote, apparently, because apparently 9 weeks before this was filmed, they found they were given some journals of Lionel that he took from his work, the director. So they used some of that particular line was something that Lionel had wrote as something that the king had told him.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. I mean, which obviously lends itself to how much more information were taken from his journals and put into the film. I mean, obviously, any film like this, there's going to be some artistic license going on. For me, this is not so much about the historical accuracy of the film. This is much more about somebody overcoming a speech impediment who just happened to become the future king of England. I've had friends in the past who've had speech impediments, and you can see how debilitating speech impediments are for these people. Once they know you as a person, it becomes a lot easier, but speaking in public and dealing with people who they're not accustomed to, that speech impediment, that psychological issue that they have, that anxiety about speaking to new people is heightened. It's about public speaking, and for those who are learning a language like we are, like the people who are watching this, it's that foray into speaking this other language which is not yours, potentially to natives, and how frightening that is for everybody, you know, until you can dominate and master, at least to a certain extent, the language, and you have confidence in yourself. But we know, and the people watching this who are language learners will know that it's very easy to write a language. It's very easy to read a language. It's hellishly terrifying to actually speak and to know that what you're saying makes sense to the person who's listening, especially if that person is a native speaker. So, I mean, for me, one of the reasons was not because it's based on historical fact. It was about this issue of speaking in public and the problems which language learners have, going over that bridge, sort of crossing over that precipice and launching themselves into speaking this new language which they're acquiring, and the fears that you have that every other word you're going to get wrong, every conjugation of every word you're going to get wrong. It is about how we all have to overcome speaking in public, but that public literally might be just another person using this newly acquired language that we have.
So true. I mean, I have that fear every time I have coworkers in my office that are native Spanish speakers, and I hesitate. I'm very fearful to speak Spanish in front of them. And even in groups, I think it's easier because they're strangers in other countries that you're talking to on a phone or in Zoom. But there's still that fear, and I find like, oh, well, when I wrote it down, it was so much easier. But when I was trying, I had Julio ask me the other day, oh, well, how was your day? And I struggled to tell him like the different things I did that day. But if I sat down and I wrote it down, as you said, it was just so much easier. So it's absolutely true. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, one of the other reasons, and it's not really a reason, but the Lionel's practice room, the room where he does his office, is a real room. It's a real building, and it's just opposite the BBC in central London. I filmed there, and I walked in, and this is not a set. It's a physical, actual building. It's about 5 or 6 stories. As you walk in, you kind of walk into this very tattered, very tired, very worn room. You can tell it's 120, 130, 140-year-old. And that back wall where they have the sofa and...
Feel the looseness of the jaw. Good, little bounces. Shoulders loose. Now loose.
And Bertie is sat. That's real. It's absolutely real.
I love that. It was such a beautiful kind of tattered, different greens and yellows.
This has not been made up. I mean, not as far as I'm aware. The rest of the building, looking around, it was just in as an unkempt way as that room. It's a lovely big room. That glass roof is real. It's all real. It's absolutely all real. And I filmed there, shortly, about 2 years after the film. It was like, oh my God. This is just, thinking it's a set, and you suddenly walk into something and you suddenly go, this is actually a real room. This is a real building. So, I mean, for me, it was another reason, because I've actually been there. I love the camera work because there's some very interesting framing going on. Mm-hmm. Bertie sat in the seat on the sofa, and the framing is just so unconventional. Some very unconventional camera work going on. There's a lot of use of wide angle, not super wide angle, but wide angle, where they really used the wide angle to kind of lead you through things, which again is kind of quite unusual. So I enjoyed, when I went to the cinema to watch this film, I don't think I watched the film, I watched the camera work, if that makes sense. I was just like, wow, I wouldn't have shot it like that. It's just like really unconventional. I loved it for the camera work, and loved the fact how the DOP had really thrown convention to the wind in terms of how lots of it had been shot and framed. So, I mean, like I said, when I went to the cinema to watch this, I kind of don't think I really watched the film. I knew what was happening. I knew what was going on, but my primary focus was upon the camera work, was upon the framing, and that was really what caught my attention initially.
Yeah, I agree. I think I read that the wide angles were kind of also used to kind of like emphasize his uncomfortableness of speaking, because if you have those wide angles, it's going to like probably make it look that way, because it's going to make him look a little bit wider or whatnot. So
I think as well, there's a lot of stuff on location there. Looking at a lot of those places, I think most of that is location. At times you don't have the facility to remove a wall and put the perfect lens on, but certainly, yeah, I mean, I can see why the wide angle was used and how beautifully it was used. I mean, slightly sort of leaving that aside and kind of going back, one of the things which is interesting is that those with a speech impediment, as I understand, many years ago, when I was still a student, I worked for some speech therapists, helping them with videos for people who had strokes and were regaining speech. So, I mean, I kind of got a little bit of an understanding, but it was interesting that there's a little sequence where Lionel and Bertie, the future king, is swearing quite profusely and getting over his speech problem as his anger takes over, and his anger overcomes his issue of his shyness or his inability to speak. And they have this whole tirade of quite silly swear words.
Yes.
I'm not going to go into it, but there's this little sequence where this takes place and he overcomes his speech impediment, his stutter, his stammer. And again, another little piece for me which works as one of the primary kind of meeting between Bertie and Lionel is that Bertie puts a pair of earphones on him and he's playing loud music, and Bertie then is reading from a piece of Shakespeare, I think.
Yes,
and his speech impediment goes.
Right.
You know, but later, I mean, the next scene or so is him lying there, Bertie, the future king, lying there, the Duke of York, as he was at that particular point, lying on this sofa, this very elegant sofa, listening to music, smoking. There's a lot of smoking in this film. There's a lot of smoking in this, indicative of the era, I think.
One of his first speech person saying, "Take the smoke into your lungs. It make your lungs stronger." And then he starts to smoke in Lionel's office, and Lionel says, "Put that out." And he says, "My doctor says it's good for me. It's good for the lungs." And he says, "It'll kill you." And he said, "No." Like, I think he said they're all idiots. And then he said, "Well, they're all knighted." And then Lionel says, "Well, that makes it official. Like, they're official idiots then." But getting back to where you say about him being angry and the swearing and all, but there's the other scene towards the end before the coronation where he brings up the king, brings up the fact that Lionel doesn't have any official qualifications, and Lionel's like, "Oh, I never told you that I did. I said just call me Lionel." And one of the things he did is he then sits down.
What are you doing? Get up! You can't sit there! Get up!
Why not? It's a chair.
No, that is not a chair.
He's like, "You can't sit there," and he starts getting really angry. And Lionel's just like, "So what does it matter? Like, look, people carve their names here, and some of it's just a chair." And he gets all angry, and then all of a sudden the king realizes that, yes, I can actually talk. I can talk without stammering, because he's doing it right then.
Why should I waste my time listening?
Because I have a right to be, and I have a voice.
I mean, that's again, it's how they bring this relationship of the pair of them together, and the fact that there had been a rift prior to that. and Lionel had kind of gone back, trying to not gain favor again, but to try and get back to help Bertie. The relationship is brought back together, I think, as Bertie realizes, and the royal family and those around realize that, you know, we're now in a situation where he really has to step up to the mark and make these speeches and bring the Britain and the Commonwealth together. But obviously he has all these hangers-on. So he has the Archbishop, and he has other people around who have probably found out that Lionel doesn't have any qualifications. And you're quite right. I think in one of the first meetings, Bertie says to him something like doctor, and he says, "Don't call me doctor." Yeah. Because he knows he has no qualifications. He's just somebody who has learned. And I think the other one is, there's a little bit with Churchill, who again has this quite, now obviously a very recognizable speech pattern, speech impediment. There's a little bit where just before he goes in for this massive speech, Churchill says something to the effect that he had a speech impediment as a child, and he said, "I've used it to my effect." If I was to recommend this, it would be for somebody with a reasonably decent level of English, not perfect, but good enough to maintain a reasonable conversation. This film should work on a lot of levels as something which they can watch, they can enjoy, and most of all, they can probably follow a good chunk of the dialogue without using subtitles, without having to kind of stop and start it.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, I mean, so on the whole, I mean, did you enjoy the film?
Absolutely. Like I said, I had watched it back in 2010, and I watched it again, and I did enjoy it. I had my daughter watch it. She's 12, and she liked it. It got approval from a 12-year-old in the United States. So.
Fantastic. So do we have another film? I mean, what?
I was actually thinking of another film that's British, but it has an American that is playing a Brit. So it's a movie that I've always gone back to, and I'll many times in my life. I think the first time I watched it is in 1999, and it is called Sliding Doors. And I believe she plays a pretty convincing Brit.
Yes. Now, wow. Now, it is a lot. It probably is 1999 when I saw that.
It's just I think it's an uplifting film of like, if one door closes, another opens, and that's what I've always done when I had a time that things were really tough. I watched this movie. You know, I just like picked myself up, and I think it's a great movie. So what do you think?
Absolutely. If I remember rightly, the sliding doors are a reference to the tube.
The tube. In fact, I think we started having a conversation about it because you're not supposed to talk to anybody on the tube, apparently.
Yeah, I think, yeah, absolutely. Well, okay, it's onto eBay and find myself a used copy of Sliding Doors. It's not a film I've got. Like I said, I have seen it many, many years ago, and I did enjoy it. So it'll be good to rewatch it after probably 20 odd years, because it is. I think I watched it not long after it came out. Went to the cinema to watch it, so it'll be nice to kind of rewatch it and get a better idea as to what that film's about. And yeah, well, let's go hunting on eBay.
All right, absolutely.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for today. Fantastic chat about a fantastic film. Hope everybody enjoys it. And here's to the next one, Sliding Doors.